There's an article here over here. I urge you not only to pick it up, but to actually read it. There are a lot of people, and I'm included, who have books that you sort of, well, you know what I'm talking about. You get them, and they're sort of on the shelf, and maybe you massage them a little bit. Well, this is, I hope you don't just pick this up, but actually read it. This is just a wonderful summary of some of the empirical data that is at stake in this topic, in my discussion of this topic. And rather than me, I hate people who lecture by going through data. It's part of my training as a political scientist, and I can still remember those people in graduate school up there at the board, with these numbers that just. So I don't do that. I don't do numbers, at least in a very elaborate way, and yet I'm going to be making some claims that are based on numbers. They're in here. And I have to plug that as well, because Peter Steinfeld's, I think, is a wonderful article, and to some extent a friend of mine, so anyway, I encourage you to read that. The topic for this series of 4 talks is listed right out there on the poster as a topic in theology, and it is that to some extent. But I forewarn you, if you're planning to hear 4 theological lectures, you're not going to get them. I've been here on, I think the last time I talked about Karl Barth, and I assure you that was theology. But this topic is more sociological, much more sociological. It has a theological dimension. It has a practical dimension that's very important for the life of the church. And that, frankly, is the reason I've chosen to address it. 3 of the talks will be mainly sociological, and then there will be a 4th one on sort of implications for the church, and in that you'll get some theological reflection. This is a topic that is of direct practical relevance to the life of this church, indeed all churches today. I like to think that all of my topics are relevant, but you understand what I'm saying. This one in particular, and here's why. Whenever we think about the church's mission in the world, we try to form in our own minds, we just do, a certain image of what's out there, what the world is. And very often, the image that is in our minds, and certainly journalists in particular help us think this way, is to say it's a secular world. I can't tell you the number of times I go around from church to church giving talks like this. I can't tell you the number of times in sermons I have heard in this secular world. To some extent that is true. To some extent that is true. But I want to stress, and this is the theme of this series of talks, and again, if this is not what you want to hear, go somewhere else. I'm going to, as they say in the Academy, problematize that idea. I think it's a lot more complicated than that, and I think the complexity is something we need to understand about our situation today. I think we will be more realistic, more pragmatic in thinking about our situation if we get a more complicated image of what is out there. Let me call your attention to the title of this article. Globally, religion defies easily identified patterns. Globally, and I'm going to be talking to some extent globally, as well as here in the verbs. Globally, it defies. Now, in the Academy today, and you will have to bear with me, I'm going to be to some extent reporting on debates that are going on in the Academy among people who are just interested in religion as an academic interest, as well as, of course, other people. There's a great debate about this, and it's a very healthy debate. It's challenging one of the fundamental ideas of modern thought. One of the fundamental ideas of modern thought, I'm going to be sort of giving a substance to that in just as challenging it, and it's challenging it in part because of things that are happening right now. Things that are happening. And the claim that is made by, frankly, people like myself, I'm a partisan in this, is that increasingly when you look at what has been going on in the world with respect to religion in the last 30 years, last 40 years, it's very hard to hold on to the old cliches. I'll give you some sort of substance of what that means in a moment. Now, what I want to do in this talk today mainly is talk about what those old cliches were. I think probably many people in this room, as I talk, are going to say, yeah, I know that, I've heard that, but I just want to get that clearly in focus. I want to talk in particular about the idea of secularity as it emerged in early modern Western European thought, very influential in certain parts of American life in the 18th and the 19th century. Talk about secularization theory, something that, boy, in graduate school it just poured into me. I'll tell you a couple of stories about that. But it's been a very important theme in the social sciences, sociology, political science, to some extent economics, more tacitly in economics. And that's mainly what this talk is about, and then in the latter part of the talk I'll just give you a hint of what's problematic about it and why it's being challenged today. In the next talk, next week, I'm going to go into those problems much more. So next week is about our situation. And then the third talk is going to be about contemporary efforts to rethink this whole topic. What are the alternatives? What are some of the better alternatives today to old-fashioned, if I can put it that way, old-fashioned secularization theory? By the way, I've learned that the people who hold that theory just hate it when you say it. It's kind of fun to say it's old-fashioned. Old-fashioned. I'm not old-fashioned. Yes, you are. All right, let me give you a working definition of secularity. This is actually the conceptual aspect of this is very complicated. But I'm going to give you a very simple characterization, which I think probably corresponds to a lot of what goes through your mind and my mind when you hear that phrase, the secular world. Or, let me just say, there is such a thing, I think, as a secular person, or a secular life. You know, he's living his life in a secular way. It's sometimes associated very neatly, and I think too neatly, with simply unbelief or skepticism. That is, unbelief or skepticism about traditional religious claims. That's part of it. But I would suggest that there's maybe a larger aspect of this, which helps us to understand why it's a temptation even for people like ourselves, who are people of faith, people very self-consciously faith. And that is, I think secularity is better understood as worldliness. As worldliness. A pastor whom I respect a great deal, once said to me somewhat not bitterly, just somewhat sadly. He was talking about a congregation he was serving in a very limited way as an interim pastor, and he said, they're wonderful people, except they're so worldly. So worldly. Meaning, and I really pressed him on this, and he said, you know, he said Bonhoeffer was right, and Bonhoeffer was one of the people who worked on the relationship between secularity and theology. He said they live their lives, even though they profess belief in God and go to church, they live their lives as though there were no God. That's a very, I hope you see the existential dimension. They live their lives as though there were no God. And to some extent, let me just say parenthetically, because of the way our world is organized and the way so many of us have been trained, I think we're almost forced to do that. You know, the physician who has to think a certain way, who practiced medicine a certain way, the professor who has to think a certain way, etc. So, secularity, worldliness, that's what we're talking about here. And it's been an enormous temptation for reasons I'm going to get into. Now, I want to give a little intellectual history of this because it is just central to the whole topic. The reason why we use that term, secular world, secularism, talk about that, the reason why we do that is because something which was very much sort of the work of intellectuals has floated into the wider culture and become part of the thinking of all the rest of us. We pick up, it sort of trickles in. This is the trickle-down version of culture. You know, somebody gets a hot idea, and then 15 other people say that's a really great idea, and then eventually it's, you know, in our journalism and the media and so forth. In this case, it really caught. Where does it come from? 17th, 18th century. That's 1600s, 1700s. Now, in the world I inhabit, which in a lot of my teaching is the world of intellectual history, that is, in my case, the history of political ideas, that's the beginning of modernity. That's the beginning of the modern world for the following reason. There's an enormous break that takes place in that period, a very self-conscious break, away from all that came before. And the sort of the pioneering thinkers, the big names, at least many of them, are quite self-consciously saying, they thought, but now we're going to think this other way. Now, I'm going to mention some of those names in a moment, but that's what I think that's where all this starts. It's a product of that turn. And I want to suggest, in sort of celebration of that, because I don't think you can explain the importance of it any other way, it's a kind of epical development, not just in the history of the West, but in the history of the world. We're still living with the consequences of it. All over the world, as sort of Western empowerment sort of has had its ripple effects all over the world. To some extent, other parts of the world emulated what came out of this. I mean, that's part of the great conflict still in the world. But the origins of it are this period. This period, it will not surprise you at all to hear that I think it's related to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, in the following way. First of all, there were all kinds of really pioneering initiatives that were taken in understanding of the faith in that period. I've characterized the Reformation as a kind of reinvention of Christianity. And I think in a very literal sense, that's what it was. Our spiritual forebears looked at the Roman Catholic Church and said, that's not what we think, reading our Bibles, is authentic Christianity. And so they tried to reconstruct it. It helped that they were kicked out of the church. So literally, they had to start over, but still. And they did. And they were, well, you know, when it comes to some of these figures, but I think they did extraordinary things, not only about critique, but also, this is the great revolutionary challenge, not only critique, but putting something in its place. That's the heart. Now, having said all that, let me say the thing that any critic of the Reformation would say, and it's terribly important for understanding this story that I'm going to be laying out this morning. It was a bloody, bloody time. It was a bloody, bloody time. Just like the Middle East today. They didn't have the weaponry we've got today. Otherwise, they would have blown each other up easily. But, you know, it's got the same feel. People, you know, refugees streaming across, you know, part of Europe. People being, you know, tortured, you know, body parts maimed, literally. I mean, you know, in the French Wars of Revolution, routinely, thousands of people were murdered in their beds. Damn papist, I'm going to not take you out. Or more precisely, if you're a prominent guy who can give leadership, I'm really going to take you out. All in the name of religion. You know, religious zeal was just overflowing. If you're interested in religious zeal, read about that. Now, I stress that for the following reason. Toward the end of that period, many very smart people, many very humanistic people said, we have got to get away from this. That's part of the story of secularization. We've got to get away from this. John Locke, for example, from whom so much of the political ideas of the American founding were drawn, wrote a work, very interesting work to read, published in the 1690s, called The Reasonableness of Christianity. And what he was trying to do was two things in there. One, explain that it was still possible for a reasonable person to believe in the gospel after all of this terrible stuff had been done. But he also wanted to develop a kind of softer version of Christianity that people could embrace who didn't think that it was about killing people. Reasonableness of Christianity, note that So one thing that's going on in this period is a sort of dialectical movement between really intense conflict and just you can imagine in people's lives, especially if you were not one of the zealots, thinking, can't these people stop it? You know, it's ruining our lives. And then at the same time, and this is just an extraordinary coincidence, the scientific revolution, the same time. The steps leading gradually to what we now characterize as modern science, 16th and 17th century, Copernicus and all that stuff is happening at exact, I hope you see the kind of extraordinary mystery of that. Scientific revolution, which from the point of view of all of its proponents was this great breakthrough. And breakthrough in a double sense. Not only a new way of thinking, this is very clear in the writings of the sort of main propagandists, but it's empowerment. We can take control, and you're going to shiver about this, we can take control of the natural environment and manipulate it for the improvement of our condition. That's more than anything else, that's the source of that idea. Now, I hope a certain thing is forming in your mind. Once you put those two things together, you can easily see why in the next century, the Enlightenment, note the term, the Enlightenment, light dawning, you know, the Enlightenment, light dawning. The next century, people would say, well, we have got an answer to this mess that those religious people have gotten us into. We can develop a way of life based upon reason, get rid of all that superstitious nonsense, and we'll all live in peace and harmony, and also have prosperity because of modern technology flowing out of modern science. That's the promise. The Enlightenment, the imagery is clear. All the people who were caught up in the Enlightenment, figure like Immanuel Kant, in Scotland, David Hume, in the United States, people like Ben Franklin, Tom Jefferson, all those people were caught up in this idea of what? A worldly way of life. A worldly way of life that somehow would get us away from the terrible situation that could be created by religious passions. Cool those religious passions. Cool those passions. Develop this worldly way of life. This worldly way of life, they were quite deliberate about this. Let's stop fussing about all that, you know, heaven and hell and you know, fighting about the Lord's Supper. I mean, I kid you not, there were real battles, you know, pitched battles fought about the Eucharist. We smile now, we, you know, to some extent we should smile, but you know, I assure you, we've got equivalents. At any rate, the Enlightenment was a movement, political, intellectual, social, all dedicated to the proposition of changing fundamentally and improving the human condition based upon a, you might say, post-religious approach to life. Indeed, as the Enlightenment argument developed, it became a kind of predictive proposition. This is going to happen. People began to speak of it as inevitable. You're not going to stop it. By the way, that's still a theme in our thinking. You know, it's coming. Think about the way we think about technology today. It's just going to happen. You know, it's like an act of nature. It's like an act of God. It's just coming. Well, they began to think in those terms. And then, with a very optimistic vision, said, it's coming and it's going to be better. It's going to be better. I don't want to dwell on it, but I will say I think some of the spirit of the American founding, political founding, is this thing I'm talking about. You know, this new beginning here on this side of the Atlantic. Better possibilities. Next question. Assuming that's happening, and let me fill in one very important blank. Why would it happen? Well, because more and more people are going to get educated. Another big theme in the Enlightenment. Indeed, as a movement, the Enlightenment was dedicated to spreading enlightenment through education. Keep in mind, this is one of the most important things in understanding the process of modernization. In a traditional society, the vast majority of the population can't read. That's just the way it is, in a sense, to this day. And by the way, our spiritual forebears are looked upon, I'm talking about the Reformed tradition, to some extent more broadly Protestants are looked upon as agents of modernization precisely because they insisted that people be able to have the ability to read. Lay people have the ability to read. It's terribly important as a social phenomenon, quite apart from the religious aspect. And it was central, for reasons you all know, to their faith. You know, we want everybody to have his or her Bible. We want everybody to be able to read. Well, right there, you're changing a nation. It's no accident, let me just say parenthetically, it's no accident, I think, that some of the most important modern movements emerge in these highly Protestant countries. Scotland, the Netherlands, and so forth. Why? Because they work at this education. You know, when Knox and his buddies take over Scotland, one of the first things they do is mandate a form of public education in every village. Females and males, by the way. Now, once you're sort of in that frame of mind, which is our frame of mind, is it not? At least to some extent. Once you're in that frame of mind, you can begin to sort of appreciate why people would say, this is just coming, this is happening, this is going to happen. We're going to spread education, people are going to become more enlightened, they're going to appreciate more the value of modern science, they're going to have better technology available to them all the time, life is going to get better, and of course worldly, more worldly. Next question, what happens to religion? There were two theories, and this goes to the heart of the whole secularization idea. One theory was that as people become more enlightened, they will have less and less reason to believe in that stuff at all. So one prognosis. Shall we say the more skeptically inclined people? This was David Hume's tendency. And by the way, David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, was denied an academic appointment in Edinburgh because he was suspected to be not a believer. And suspected. Give him a couple of drinks and he would tell you. Anyway, prediction. 100 years down the road, religion is gone. That's, you might say, hard secularization theory. Down the road, not going to be it. The softer version, I love this to tell people about this. The softer version was articulated by Jefferson, among others. And Jefferson said, looking at the United States, the newly emerged United States, he said, within roughly a generation, they will all be Unitarians. You know how that turned out. But think about it. From his point of view, of course, we're going to have spread of education, more and more educated people. They're not going to want to be Baptists or Presbyterians or let alone Roman Catholics. They're all going to be rational in their practice of religion. Now that was a very interesting sort of theme, rational religion. By the way, that is the foundation of what I would think of as theological liberalism. If you're a liberal in theology, what it means is you put every traditional religious claim to the test of rational scrutiny, and if it won't pass muster to say, you and your rational friends, then it's what? It's got to go. So if you say, for example, Jesus Christ was God, but also man, kind of mysterious when you think about it? Well, no. And so, or let alone virgin birth or miracles or all that stuff. Jefferson, by the way, I'm sure you know, sort of edited the New Testament. Edited the New Testament so that all the miracles, all the mysterious stuff is out. Left with what? Well, think about this. Humanism. Humanism, ethics. And from Jefferson's point of view, that was a perfectly rational way to think about this. We've got the good stuff out of Christianity. We can forget about all that superstitious stuff. And the idea was that over time, not just highly schooled people like Jefferson, but most everybody, give them a little schooling, it's gone. Now I want to suggest to you that that's the foundation of it. 18th century, the elements are already there. And then it simply develops more and more powerfully in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I want to say just a little bit about that development. One of the most important things we all need to grasp in order to think about the phenomenon of secularization is that it was greatly abetted by industrialization. Keep in mind, all the things I've been talking about up to this point are pre-industrial. In other words, it's horse and buggy. Tom Jefferson, Ben Franklin, they live in a horse and buggy world. Well, what comes in the 19th century and on to the 20th century are railroads and in other words, you might summarize it all by saying, and boy, this is true of us, an ever more mechanized world. Just think about it, the mechanization of our lives. Think about the mechanization of your kitchen. Think about that. You know? I mean, I don't want to go into the details of breakfast here, but just think about all the mechanized stuff which of course we take for granted, we rely on, or the mechanized part. No confessions here, but all the mechanized stuff having to do with communication with other people. Get your phone out, look at your phone. By the way, I ban all that stuff in my classes at Georgetown in order to keep their attention. And by the way, it works. It works. There's a little resistance at the beginning, and then people say, after about a week or so, he's right. He's right. And when there's much pushback, I just defer them to the TAs who are younger than I am. And it's their idea. It's their idea. Otherwise, and it's true, it is their idea. And by the way, the teaching assistants say if you allow electronic devices in the classroom, you've got just endless distraction, phones or anything. So ban them. And I have, and it works. Of course, some of them are learning how to write. It's this ancient art. Anyway, now I want to stress, industrialization powerfully confirmed, at least initially, the view of those who saw secularization coming. One reason for that is that industrialization brought urbanization. Cities have tended to be much more conducive. People who live in cities have an urban way of life. They tend to be more, shall we say, attracted to the secular impulses than people who work the land. It's just a fact. All over the world. It's now pretty well confirmed. Just all over. It's not just that, but urbanization has been a powerful sort of engine of secularization. And if you see that beginning to develop, it's a natural consequence of industrialization as you get bigger and bigger cities and an urban way of life and so forth. Well, and people looking ahead said that's just where we're headed. The other thing, which powerfully contributed to confirmation of the idea that secularization is just our fate, is the emergence of the industrial working class, and to some extent, its parallel, the entrepreneurial class, related to industry. But the industrial working class tended, especially in Western Europe, to be caught up in secular ideologies which were very self-consciously secular, socialism in particular. Most of the socialist movements, which these are just enormous magnets for working class people, they were kind of self-consciously anti-religious. Of course, under the influence of Marxism in particular, but not just Marxism. And another thing to note about this, which we'll come back and talk about, especially when this is true of guys, there's something about men and secularization. There's something about men and secular. Men have always been more, and it was dramatically revealed in the case of the industrial working class, were always had much stronger tendencies towards, you might say, overtly secular postures than women. And by the way, that to some extent that's true today. If you look around, how many people are there in church that tend to be more women than men? And there's this whole ethos that developed in the modern world in particular that said religion is, it's not for real men. It's for, it's kind of girly stuff. Now,
say more?
No, I'm not going to say more. I'll just tell you, as a, you know, there is absolutely clear data. You know, that really across the board, country after country after country, it is, to put it as a strategic question, it is hard to get men in church and keep them there than it is women. Yes?
You say country after country, but that's not my image of Islam. Do you know if it's different there?
Yeah, I do. Another topic, another day. Although I don't think it's always been that way. But anyway, believe me, that's a wonderful objection, and I'm just going to admit it. Now, so you've got emerging in Western Europe and the United States, industrial societies, 19th and 20th century, with people who have a sort of way of life that is more modern. You know, they're not horse and buggy people. They're living in cities. They're working in factories, or if they're more educated, they've got some technical knowledge. Oftentimes, they're engineers. They're whatever. That gives rise to a social science theories which sort of confirm all of the claims made by the 18th century thinkers who tended to be more philosophical. Social theorists, and then more formally social scientists, one after another, sort of lined up with and developed a sort of elaborate theory of secularization. Secularization theory is a product of the 19th and 20th centuries. Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, John Stuart Mill, my guy on whom I work so much, Max Weber, famous German sociologist. There was many of the leading, and by the way, economists, Herbert Spencer. You know, there were just all kinds of people who sort of said, in a, shall we say, a more scientific way. Religion, and here's the key point, religion, we're now seeing, they would say. We're now learning that religion is not the permanent human condition. That's what's at stake in this whole discussion. Let me be clear. It's not, from the point of view of secularization theory, it's not a permanent fact about human beings. It's rather a phase. A phase that, it's been a long phase, forever it's been part of human experience, but it is something that is in process of fading away. And if you want to get the nub of the theory, which is implicit in that, we'll see, you know, this is an important idea for you to have in your minds as we go through this whole thing. I think at its core, the sort of social scientific claim in this regard is the following. That religion ultimately is well understood, best understood as a kind of substitute technology. That is, from the modern point of view. And here's what I mean by this. The reason why all those people, back then, for millennia, and of course in many parts of the world still, that was clearly recognized, still are what? Are praying. The reason they're praying is because they haven't got a better technology. When the flood comes and you haven't got a good technology, what do? You please God, or gods, or whatever. Please God, deliver me. Religion as a substitute technology. Or another way to put it would be to say religion as a primitive technology. Now, if you think about religion that way, and I think that's a sort of foundational idea in secularization theory, even though it's oftentimes glossed over, I think if you sort of bore down, that's what's ultimately assumed. Yes?
Doesn't religion also have an explanatory function to it? We can't explain things that are happening, but today we can explain many more things that happened than 500 years ago.
Absolutely. And
so
by the way,
there's no need for
I think,
religion.
Adrian, that would be part of the same package. But
it's the other side of the coin, sort of.
Exactly. That's a different. But why do you need the explanation? You need the explanation in order to manipulate your mind.
Right.
Well, if you haven't got a really efficient tool, then you use the next best thing, and you dream up all this stuff. And of course, there are other layers that are added onto this. There are priests and all these people who've got a stake in putting the wool over your eyes, and there's all that stuff going on. But the basic idea is this is something which you rely on if you lack the things that modern men are creating. That is, tools which enable us efficiently to control our environment. And of course, the idea was we're going to be able to control our environment ever more effectively, and as we do so, we will have less and less and less need for all of that stuff. Now, modernization theory, as it began to develop really in the 20th century, as people were starting to compare countries, especially in the 1950s and 60s, as we began to look around the world and talk about development projects, develop whole theories of how countries modernize. Even in those theories, the claim was, as they become more modern, all over the world, as they become more modern, they will become less religious, at least in this sense. There was a softer version of the claim. If people don't stop believing altogether, what they will do, this is sort of the soft alternative, they won't give it up altogether, but they will privatize it. They will make it into their own private sort of belief system, which means the following. The public world is going to be dominated by secular ideas and practices. Let me conclude this with a story. This is part of my presentation is a story. I was in graduate school in the late 60s and early 1970s, at least in the political science part of my education. I will never forget a seminar, or a moment at a seminar. I forgot most of the seminar. But there was one particular moment about this topic, which it's etched in my mind. All guys, and we're talking, it was a comparative politics. That's sort of a political science version of political sociology. And we're reading, and there was 1 week on religion. And we read this stuff, and this guy who was, how do I say this? He was very authoritative in his pronouncements. Sort of write it down in the book. And he said the following: gentlemen, we're all graduate students, getting ready for careers in teaching, scholarship, and so forth. He said, gentlemen, early 1970s, if you have a personal interest in this topic, you might want to delve into it a little more. But my sense is the significance of this for politics is fading. And you guys are going to be teaching, writing, and so forth in the last part of the 20th century, first part of the 21st century. I think religion is a fading force. Mm-hmm. And therefore, unless you've got a personal interest in it, just be smart and invest in something else. And when you think about that, that's really kind of precious. Mm-hmm. That's right on the threshold of this explosion of intense religiosity in the United States and indeed around in much of the rest of the world. And of course now, in our department, we can't get enough people who are knowledgeable about religion. Why? Because it's such a politically important phenomenon. But he was articulating, and he did add some stuff. He was articulating in a very almost pure, crisp, practical way this ideology, which by that time had developed, that the more modern countries become, the less there's going to be religion, and insofar as religion is there at all, it's not going to have any public significance, any political significance. It's always been a kind of cautionary note to me about sort of predicting, especially to students who might remember. That guy is now deceased, but I've oftentimes wondered, boy, what would be an interesting conversation to have. But even 20 years later, I remember in the 1990s thinking, wow, boy, was he way off. Yes.
I happened to have an encounter with a professor at USC. We were on a radio show together, and we were talking about paranormal. That could be extended to religion. And it resonates with me about secularism, because if you take secularism to its end, which is technology, the way he explained that paranormal is that which has not been proven by scientific fact yet.
Yep.
And so if you extend that, then secularism actually will be pro-religion eventually, as things are discovered.
I'm not going to comment yet. but that's exactly confirmation. Yeah.
Well, oddly, I think there's a large, I don't want to say large, there's a percentage of the population that still believes what your deceased
course.
speaker believes it so strongly that an argument to the contrary basically comes to them as, well, that's just not true.
Yeah. That's, of course, the classic definition when you think about it. This is deeply ideology. You know, really, I'm going to believe this irrespective. Now, so I've painted the picture, and believe me, it's just a rough overview of the background to this topic. We have a well-developed body of thought which for a long time was held, not by everybody, but by, shall we say, increasing number of respected academicians and more broadly public intellectuals who would just take this for granted. And by the way, it's still the background, when you think about it, of that claim that I referred to at the outset of the talk. We live in a secular world. Well, and by the way, people will look at evidence like this interesting phenomenon of the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, and read that, if you read the articles carefully, again and again, through the lens of secularization theory. The rise of the nuns is, aha, here it comes. Here it comes, finally. Well, now, why is this whole body of thought that I've been analyzing in the last few minutes suspect? Or, to use the strong word that I've got up there, why is it in crisis? You can read articles and books which say pretty much the following. That theory is just wrong. That's a very strong claim. And there are people who were proponents of secularization theory, the most notable being Peter Berger, who, by the way, was a kind of Lutheran lay theologian as well as a very gifted sociologist, but because he was a Lutheran lay theologian, he had no stake in these claims. He just felt the evidence compelled him to say, you know, modernization leads to secularization, it just is going to happen. Now he says, flatly, I was wrong. That's at the end of a career to say, you know, I've been writing for 40, 30 years, and I was wrong. And I was wrong, and well, now why would he say that? Or why would other people say, we need a new theory, we need a new understanding, and of course the implication is not just a new theory, we need a new take on what's going on in the world. Two things. Many things, but two things in particular. One, I'm going to give you a bibliography next week so you can look at some of the relevant writings for yourself. Some of it's fascinating, some of it fortunately is readily available in popular forms. But broadly, we've been living through, we all know this, we just need to get it in focus, an enormous, extraordinary, unpredicted religious resurgence throughout much of the world. I mean, that's part of Peter Steinfeld's article. There's been an explosion of successful missionary activity. I'm talking about mainly sort of among nationals. China is the most obvious case, but not the only one. Explosion of growth among Christians, of course also Muslims. There's been actually an increase when you think about the sort of percentages of people who are religious in particular countries, with one particular very important exception, Western Europe. We'll talk about that. That's why this is a very complicated case, a very complicated thing to sort out. I would say Western Europe and the European diaspora are a very important exception. They're the best evidence for old-fashioned secularization theory, but most of the rest of the world seems to be, in important ways, moving in the opposite direction. Towards what? More active religiosity, more intense religiosity, and now to complete the picture, not only intense religiosity, but religiosity which refuses to stay privatized. I mean, that's one of the startling things, one of the very interesting and difficult things, frankly, to deal with about our own contemporary situation. Of course, if you don't agree with the forces that are surging in the name of religion in our politics, you say, what are they doing? And by the way, the debate about religion and politics in our time is heavily infused with secularization theory and people who, they shouldn't be, is what they say over and over again. They shouldn't be. They shouldn't be in religion. Or they shouldn't be in public life. But where's that coming from? Now, so you've got all this stuff going on, sort of intense religiosity, growing religiosity in many places. In some cases, just an explosion. The Chinese case I'll talk a little bit about. It's just mind-boggling. In countries which are undergoing modernization, or in the case of the United States, which is also a very important laboratory for all of this, and it's in itself is a complex mix. New England is one thing, the South is another, etc. But the United States is in some respects the most modern country. That's the irony. If you use the sort of indices having to do with technology, for example, sort of use of technology, use of development of advanced technology, there's no way you can say the United States is a backward country. I hope you see the problem here. If you've got sort of, at least to some degree, flourishing religiosity in the United States combined with what the Europeans themselves recognize as advanced technology, you can't quite easily make sense of that in terms of modernization theory. I mean, that's the fascinating thing about European critiques on this. They say Americans are backward, except when it comes to technology. Well, wait a minute here. The theory said, now that's one part. I hope you see right there is room for us to talk for several weeks. But the other thing, which is also striking, is modernization theory presupposed the goodness of modernity. Unambiguous goodness of modernity. Progress. Idea of progress. Well, I think to some extent, if you can continue to say that in a kind of unqualified way, you just haven't read the right books. Let me be a little blunt about it. Maybe a little snotty about it. And of course the most obvious reason for that is the whole rethinking that's going on now with respect to everybody in this room knows about it with respect to our relationship to the natural environment. Because what? I referred, remember, my talk about the scientific revolution and its benefits. Its benefits were going to come from our ability to take control of the natural environment and keep manipulating it ever more effectively. Well, we can continue to do that, to be sure, but now we have second thoughts, to put it mildly, about the advisability of doing that. Now, that's the best version. I'm coming to a close here, but that's the best version, the strongest version, it seems to me, for people who say, well, we need to be somewhat reflective now about the whole modern package. Well, if you're starting to have second thoughts about the sort of the wisdom of the whole modern package, and I don't mean throwing it out, I'm not saying anti-modern, but critical second thoughts about modernity, naturally, one possibility is, well, one of the reasons why there's a religious resurgence going on is that even if people haven't read all the books I've referred to, they sort of feel it in their bones that there's something that needs to be retained that has in part to do with religion. That's just the beginning. But fortunately for you, I haven't got time to do any more. So we got maybe 2 minutes for rebuttals here. Rob has already given me one objection.
What did you say in response to Rob?
I said, I'm going to duck the question.
You can talk about it for lunch.
All right, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
What religion?
Thank you.